Picture this. In the dead of night, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, a coffin that's centuries old just creaks open. A figure rises, and it casts this shadow of fear that is stretched across generations. I mean, we all know this image, right? It's Dracula, the world's most famous vampire. But tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on the story behind the story.
You know, ever since Bram Stoker published his Gothic masterpiece way back in 1897, Count Dracula has been the ultimate symbol of the vampire. But what's so fascinating is that this fictional monster is almost always tied to a very real and honestly maybe even more terrifying historical figure.
So on one hand, you've got Count Dracula, the undead lord from Stoker's novel, and on the other, you have Vlad III, a real-life 15th century prince from a place called Wallachia, which is in modern-day Romania. The big question is, how on earth did the story of a real warlord get so tangled up with a fictional vampire? Okay, let's start with the man himself, Vlad III, because history basically has two completely different versions of this guy. I mean, depending on who you ask, he was either this incredible national hero who saved his people, or he was a sadistic tyrant who absolutely reveled in cruelty. To Romanians even today, he was a courageous defender, a patriot who stood up against the massive, overwhelming force of the Ottoman Empire. But to his enemies, and really to most of the world, he was known by a much more sinister name, Vlad the Impaler. And believe me, that's a title he earned through acts of just unimaginable brutality. So what could possibly make a man so cruel? Well, to really get a handle on Vlad, you have to look at his childhood. It was a life forged in the nonstop violence and political chaos of 15th century Europe. I mean, his life was just defined by trauma from a really young age. When he was only 11, he was sent away as a political hostage to the Ottoman court. A few years after that, his father and his older brother were brutally murdered by rivals. So by the time he was just 17 years old, he was already fighting a bloody war to get his father's throne back. This kind of upbringing, it pretty much guaranteed he'd become a ruthless leader.
And when he finally did seize power, his entire rule was defined by one thing: absolute terror. He used this extreme cruelty not just to wipe out his enemies, but to control his own people and enforce his own very strict personal moral code.
The scale of his cruelty was just staggering. To stop an advancing Ottoman army, Vlad created what was essentially a grotesque forest of the impaled. He left the bodies of some 20,000 captured enemies displayed on giant stakes. The sight was apparently so horrifying that the Ottoman Sultan himself turned his army around and just left. And his cruelty was often really symbolic. There's this story where Ottoman diplomats refused to take off their turbans in his presence, citing religious custom. So Vlad said he would help them uphold their tradition by having their turbans nailed directly to their heads. Every single brutal act was a calculated message of defiance.
Okay, so we've definitely established that the real Vlad was a genuinely terrifying figure. No question there. But does that automatically make him the inspiration for a blood-sucking vampire? Well, the truth is a lot more complicated than that.
For decades, the popular belief has been a resounding yes. But is that actually true? Well, the short answer, according to leading scholars like Professor Elizabeth Miller, is not really. The historical connection that we all kind of take for granted is actually much, much weaker than you'd think.
So where did the name come from then? Well, Vlad's father was part of a knightly group called the Order of the Dragon, or Ordo Draculonum. Dracul meant dragon, so Vlad became known as Dracula, which literally just means son of the dragon. It was a complete happy accident for Bram Stoker that, by his time, the word Drac had also picked up a second meaning in Romanian, devil.
If you actually look at Stoker's own research notes, they show he just stumbled across the name Dracula in a book about the region. A tiny footnote mentioned that it meant devil in the local language. And that was it. He loved the sound, he loved the satanic association, but there's just no evidence that he knew anything about Vlad the Impaler or his horrific deeds. So if Stoker didn't make the connection, who did? Well, the link we all know today was really made popular in the 1970s by a book called In Search of Dracula. And then it was just cemented forever in pop culture by Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 film, which straight up made Vlad the Impaler the origin story for the vampire count. All of this leaves us with this really strange and contradictory legacy for the real Prince of Wallachia. Vlad's life ended exactly how it was lived.
violently. He was killed in battle against his lifelong enemies, the Ottomans. And legend says his head was cut off and sent to the Sultan in a jar of honey as undeniable proof that the Impaler was finally dead.
So what we're left with is this stunning paradox. In his homeland of Romania, Vlad is remembered as a national hero. He's a symbol of fierce independence who defended Christianity. And yet to the rest of the world, thanks to a novelist who just happened to like the sound of his name, he is the monster, the blueprint for the most famous vampire in history.
In the end, a real man whose actual life was already the stuff of nightmares was kind of unintentionally transformed into an even greater myth. It's just a powerful reminder of how easily history can be rewritten, and it leaves us with one final big question. Where does the history end and the legend begin?